Asaji ga Yado. The village had no road left worth calling a road. Katsushiro pushed through waist-high summer grass where a street used to run, past fields gone back to wild, past house shapes that were really just the memory of houses. Above him, clouds sat low and close, the kind that promise rain and take their time about it. He'd lived here his whole life. He should have known this ground with his eyes closed. Instead, he stood in the dark, turning in place, trying to find one shape he recognized in a place that had forgotten him as thoroughly as he'd forgotten it. Then, there, a pine tree, split clean down the middle by some old lightning strike, black against a sky the color of a bruise. He knew that tree. He'd planted his life around that tree. He walked toward it, and the house was still standing. Not just standing, lived in. Light moved behind a torn paper door. Someone was home. He stood at the gate and cleared his throat, the old signal, the one you give before you knock. And a voice answered from inside, aged, worn thin by something, but a voice he would have known anywhere on earth. "Who's there?" It was his wife. Chapter 1. What he left behind. Katsushiro's family had farmed the same land in Mama in Shimosa province for 3 generations. There had been money once, and fields, and a house that didn't leak. But Katsushiro had never had the temperament for farming. He found it tedious, beneath him somehow, the kind of work a cleverer man ought to be able to avoid. So, slowly, without any single dramatic mistake, he let it all slip away. Relatives who'd once visited stopped visiting. He felt the insult of that more than he let on, and it ate at him, this quiet, constant hunger to prove them wrong. His chance arrived in the shape of a silk merchant named Sasabe no Soji, a distant relation who passed through Mama each year, buying up local cloth to sell him a capital. Katsushiro had grown friendly with him over the years, and one day he simply asked to come along, to become a merchant himself, to go to Kyoto and make something of the family name again. Sasabe agreed easily. Katsushiro sold off what remained of the family fields, bought as much white silk as the money would stretch to, and started counting the days. His wife Miyagi was, by every account, remarkable. Beautiful enough to turn heads, and sharper than that beauty besides. She heard his plan and understood immediately what it would cost her. A woman alone in an unsettled age, with no protection and no income. She argued against it as hard as a devoted wife could argue against the decision her husband had already made. It didn't move him. He was a man who, once he'd decided something, did not undecide it. And this time he decided harder than usual. So she did what was left to do. She packed his things. And on the last night she told him plainly what she was afraid of. That she would be left alone in a house with nothing. That her nerve might not hold. That the world felt too uncertain to promise anyone a tomorrow. So please, she said, remember me and come back soon. He answered the way confident men always answer women who are a rat to worry. Why would I stay away in some strange province, unmoored, when I have all of this to come back to? I'll be home by autumn, when the wind turns the kudzu leaves over. Wait for me, and don't lose your nerve. The rooster crowed. He left before the sun was fully up, walking hard toward the capital. He had no way of knowing that the autumn he'd promised her was about to become the least reliable thing in the world. Chapter 2. The Years of Waiting. The year was 1455, and that summer, the world Katsushiro had left behind came apart. The shogun's deputy in Kamakura and the regional lords who were supposed to serve him fell into open war. Fire took the deputy's own residence. He fled east into the very provinces where Miyagi sat waiting. And with him came the war. What followed was 5 years of a country eating itself. Armies marched through on someone else's orders. Bandits wore the war like a coat, burning farms under cover of it. The old fled to the hills. The young were dragged off to fight. And in the town of Mama, the women and children who remained did the only thing left to them. They ran, from rumor to rumor, never knowing which one was true. Miyagi did not run. She had one thing to hold on to: this autumn. He had said it as he left, an easy promise, the kind men make when they can't see past the next few months. She built her entire life around those 2 words. While her neighbors scattered, she stayed in a house with no husband, no servant, and less money by the day, because leaving felt like betting against his return. Autumn came. The leaves turned. He did not. She wrote it into a poem, one built on a pun that could never survive translation. A plea to a bird crying at a mountain pass whose name meant to meet. Tell him, if you go that way, tell him the autumn he promised me has already ended. There was no way to send it. The roads were somebody else's war now. And it got worse before it got survivable. A woman, alone, in a lawless season draws a particular kind of attention. Men came to her door with kindness that wasn't kindness at all. She turned them all away, and eventually stopped opening the door at all, bolting it against a world that had decided a husbandless woman was public property. 4 more winters passed like this. Rumor said the wars had ended. Rumor said they hadn't. She had no way to know which one was true, and no one left who would tell her. Meanwhile, 300 kilometers west, in a city that didn't know there was a war on, Katsushiro was doing well. He'd sold every bolt of silk. Kyoto in those years had an appetite for beautiful things, and he'd arrived with a wagon full of them. He should have gone home rich and satisfied. He meant to. Then the news came, garbled by distance the way all news is. The fighting had reached his home province. The armies had swept through Mama itself. He believed it, not because it was certain. Nothing about news from 3 provinces away was certain, but because believing it was easier than the alternative. If home was ash, there was no reason to risk the road to reach it. Grief, at a safe distance, asked less of him than hope did. He turned back toward the capital instead of forward toward her. On the way, bandits in the Kiso Mountains stripped him of everything he'd earned. He arrived in Omi province sick, broke, and, though he wouldn't have put it this way himself, relieved to have an excuse. A merchant family took him in. He recovered, he made friends, and somehow one season folded into the next, and the next, until 7 years had gone by the way water goes by, without him ever quite deciding to let them. He would tell himself later that he'd believed her dead, that there had been nothing to go back for, but he never once tried to find out if that was true. Chapter 3. The Return. In the spring of 1461, plague reached the capital. Bodies filled the roadside faster than anyone could bury them, and the sickness didn't care whether you were a farmer or a lord. It felt, to the people living through it, like the world actually ending. Not the metaphor, the thing itself. It was this, finally, that moved Katsushiro. He looked at his life, a man with no trade, no home, dependent on strangers' kindness, growing old in a place he'd only ever meant to pass through, and he understood, with a clarity that had taken 7 years to arrive, exactly how badly he'd failed the one obligation that had ever mattered. Whatever was left of Miyagi, her body, her grave, even just the place where she died, he owed her the effort of finding it. He told his hosts he was leaving. In the rains of early summer, he said his goodbyes and started walking east. 10 days later, he reached Mama. The sun was already down when he arrived, the sky pressing low with clouds that hadn't broken yet. He knew this ground, had known it his whole life, and still it took him a long time to find his bearings in it. The old bridge, the one poets used to write about, had collapsed into the riverbed. No hoofbeats, no travelers, nothing that sounded like the town he remembered. The fields had gone to weeds. Even the road was hard to find. Here and there, a house still stood, and here and there, someone had moved into one. Strangers, none of them familiar. He stood in the ruined dark, lost in what should have been the most familiar ground on earth, until he saw it. A pine tree split down the middle by lightning, black against the bruised sky. That was his tree. That was his house. He went toward it and found the house still standing. More than standing, lived in. Light behind a torn door. He cleared his throat, the old signal, and a voice answered from inside. Aged, worn thin, but unmistakably hers. The door opened, and what stood there barely resembled the woman he'd left. Filthy, sun-darkened, her hair fallen loose and ragged down her back, eyes sunk deep into her face. She looked at him and said nothing at all, just wept silently, the way people weep when the crying has been waiting 7 years to happen. He could barely speak either. When he finally found words, they came out as an apology, dressed up as an explanation. The war, the false report, the bandits, the long, slow drift of years he couldn't quite account for, even to himself. He told her he'd assumed her dead, that he'd only come back now to find her grave and grieve her properly, that finding her alive was the last thing on earth he'd expected. She answered gently, without accusation, which somehow made it worse. She told him what the years had actually been. The neighbors who fled, the ones who stayed behaving like wolves, the offers she'd refused again and again, the choice she'd made every single day to hold on to her honor rather than her safety. She told him she'd waited through one autumn, then a winter, then a spring, with no word from him at all, and that she'd thought more than once about the old poem, that a woman who dies still waiting is a woman whose heart never gets explained to the person she was waiting for. The night is short, he told her. Let's save the rest for morning. And they lay down together, as if 7 years were a distance that closing a door could undo. Chapter 4. What the morning showed him. Wind came through the torn paper of the window all night, cool against his skin. And after 10 days on the road, he slept harder than he had in years. Toward dawn, still half in a dream, he reached for a blanket that wasn't there and heard, instead of cloth, a dry, papery rustling. Something cold touched his face. Rain, he thought, and opened his eyes to check the ceiling. There was no ceiling, just the roof, torn open to the sky, a thin, worn moon hanging in what was left of the dark. He sat up. The house was in ruins around him. No real doors, floorboards rotted through and pushed up by tall grass grown right through the gaps, morning dew soaking his sleeves where he'd brushed against it. Vines choked the walls. The yard outside had gone entirely to weeds, wild as an autumn field, though it wasn't autumn at all. And the woman he'd slept beside was gone. He searched the house in a kind of numbed disbelief. But it was, unmistakably, still his house, laid out exactly as he'd built it, all the way back to the storeroom at the far end. There was no explaining it and no unseeing it. Somewhere underneath the shock, he already understood. His wife was dead, and had been for some time. And this ruin was what her house became once there was no one left to keep it. Whatever had shared his bed that night had not been a living woman. He found, where their old sleeping room had been, that the floorboards had been pulled up and the earth beneath mounded into a grave, with something like a rough shelter built over it against the weather. An offering bowl sat beside it, and inside the bowl, a strip of old paper pasted to a scrap of wood, the ink faded but the handwriting unmistakably hers. No name, no date, just one poem left behind as the only marker of when or how she died. Fooled by my own hope that he would surely return, I have lived, somehow, until today. That was when it became real to him. Not the ruined house, not the grave beneath his own floor. This, her handwriting, her voice, still insisting on its small, private grief even now. This was what broke him. He didn't know the day she died, didn't know the season, didn't know anything at all except that she had waited and kept waiting, long after waiting had stopped making any sense. He went looking for someone who might know more. The nearest house held a stranger, someone who'd only lived there a year and knew nothing of what came before him. But he mentioned an old man, one of the only people left in the village who remembered how it used to be, who still walked over to that ruined house from time to time to pray for whoever had died there. Katsushiro found him a short way off, an old man well into his 70s, bent nearly double, sitting by a low fire drinking tea. The old man looked up and said, before Katsushiro had spoken a word, "What took you so long?" Final chapter. The old man's story. The old man's name was Uruma, and he'd lived in Mama longer than anyone left standing. Katsushiro told him everything. The false report of the war, the years of drifting, the return, the impossible night. And the old man listened and finally spoke. After Katsushiro had left, he said, the war came fast, and the whole village scattered into the hills and the woods. Only Miyagi stayed, holding, the old man said, to the promise of autumn, the way some people hold to religion. He himself had stayed too lame by then to go anywhere. And so he'd watched it happen. A young woman, alone in a house that had half turned into a haunted ruin, refusing to leave a place that offered her nothing but the chance that a promise might still come true. She died on the 10th day of the 8th month. He'd buried her himself with his own hands because there was no one else left to do it. He couldn't ride, so he had no way to mark the date. There was no temple close enough to give her a proper name in death, so he'd simply kept coming back, season after season, to say what prayers he knew over an unmarked grave. For 5 years, until the night Katsushiro walked back through that door. "Whatever you met last night," the old man said, "that was her. Come back one more time to tell you everything she couldn't tell you while she was alive. Go back. Pray properly this time." They sat together at her grave until the light went, and the old man told him one more story to pass what was left of the night. Older than either of them, older than the war, older than the family names still standing in Mama. Long before either of their grandfathers were born, he said, there had lived in this same village a girl named Takona, poor, plainly dressed, barefoot, her hair never properly done, and so beautiful that every man who saw her fell in love on the spot. Farmers, soldiers, men from provinces she'd never visited. She found the attention unbearable rather than flattering, and in the end, she chose the only answer she could think to give all of them at once. She walked into the tidal shallows and let the water take her. People had been telling that story and writing poems about it for longer than anyone could remember. Even the old man's mother had told it to him as a child, and it had moved him to tears even then. But Miyagi's heart, the old man said, went further than that girl's ever did. Further, and it hurts more to say it. Katsushiro sat with that for a long time, turning it over in his head, until finally he managed to put it into a poem of his own. Clumsy, plain, unpolished, the words repeating themselves the way real grief repeats itself. Men once loved a girl named Takona here, and lost her, and grieved the way I grieve now, for a woman who loved this same ground the way she did. It's not a clever poem. It doesn't do anything with language that a more careful writer wouldn't be ashamed of. And that, in the end, may be exactly why it was the only kind of poem left that could hold what he was actually feeling. Somewhere behind him, if he'd turned to look, was the house. Dark now, no light behind the door, nothing left in it to answer if he called. But he didn't need to call anymore. He already knew who'd been waiting for him, and for how long, and that the waiting was finally, quietly, over.